The compliment that lingered. The small town of Seabrook had a rhythm all its own, slow, thoughtful, a little salty from the nearby ocean air. Evelyn Carter liked it that way. At 72, she had no desire to rush through anything. Not her morning tea, not her garden, and certainly not the annual Seabrook Community Art Show, which she attended every spring without fail. This year, she wore a soft teal shawl draped over a cream blouse and slacks. Her silver hair, swept neatly into a twist, shimmered under the gallery's warm lights. She wasn't trying to stand out, but she never really had to. As she walked past an abstract painting of ocean waves, she paused. There was something about the brushstrokes, gentle, yet full of motion, that held her still. "That one speaks, doesn't it?" a man's voice said beside her. She turned. He was about her age, maybe older, with a kind face and hands that looked like they knew their way around tools. "It does," she replied, smiling. "Soft, but strong." He nodded. Then, after a brief pause, he said, "You have quite the presence. I noticed you when you walked in. There's a kind of calm confidence about you." Evelyn blinked. She hadn't expected a compliment. And certainly not that kind. "Thank you," she said, her voice even but her heart unexpectedly stirred. "That's kind of you." She moved on through the gallery. But the words clung to her like the scent of lavender after a warm bath. Presence. Not, "You look good for your age." Not, "Pretty outfit." No, he had seen something in her. Something that had nothing to do with surface-level beauty. That evening, back home, Evelyn sat on her porch watching the dusky pink clouds roll over the hills. She thought about the man's words. Was this what true attractiveness looked like at her age? Not a desperate cling to youth, but an arrival. A radiance not defined by age, but by grace. Groundedness. Quiet power. She smiled. Almost shyly, to herself. Maybe she was just beginning to understand who she truly was. Elegance never ages. 2 days later, Evelyn met her granddaughter Emma for lunch downtown. They sat at a cozy bistro with ivy crawling up the windows and mismatched teacups that added charm rather than clutter. Emma was in her 20s, ambitious, spirited, and full of questions about the world. She always admired Evelyn, but not in the way a child idolizes a grandparent. It was something deeper now, more like quiet respect. "You always look so elegant, Grandma," Emma said between sips of chamomile. "Like, you're not trying to be stylish. You just are." Evelyn chuckled, setting her cup down gently. "That's because I finally stopped dressing for trends and started dressing for myself." Emma grinned. "Seriously though. Every time I see you, I think, that's what I want to be like when I'm older. Graceful, confident, timeless." The compliment warmed Evelyn more than the tea. She glanced down at her linen skirt and the delicate amber pendant at her neck. It wasn't expensive. None of it was. But it all felt like her, comfortable, simple, chosen with care. Years ago, she had tried to keep up with the trends, magazines that told her what color to wear, how to contour her face, what shoes would make her look younger. But at some point, she'd stopped listening. She realized her true beauty emerged not when she tried to be someone else, but when she leaned fully into who she already was. Later, as they walked to the car, a young woman passing by turned to Evelyn and said, "I love your earrings. So classic." Evelyn smiled and nodded. "Thank you." Emma caught her eye and whispered, "Told you." There was a grace in the way Evelyn moved, unhurried, rooted, whole. She didn't just wear elegance. She embodied it. And the world noticed. The power of presence. Evelyn had always been a good listener. But in recent years, something had shifted. At a neighborhood book club one Thursday evening. As the group debated a novel's ending, people naturally turned toward Evelyn, not because she raised her voice or interrupted, but because when she spoke, there was weight behind her words. "I think," she said gently, "that the author left it open because some answers don't come in words. They come in silence." The room fell still for a moment. A few heads nodded slowly. One woman murmured, "Beautifully said." It wasn't the first time that had happened. Evelyn had noticed it more and more lately, how people leaned in when she spoke, how they locked eyes and seemed to truly listen. Even strangers. Just yesterday at the farmer's market, the barista at her favorite coffee stall had said, "You have the kind of voice that makes people want to pause." She never thought of herself as particularly striking. But she was beginning to understand something. Presence is a kind of beauty that doesn't fade, it deepens. There was something magnetic about a woman who didn't rush her words, who listened as much as she spoke, who didn't try to dominate a room yet somehow grounded it with just her presence. Her friend Carol once said, "You have a way of making people feel seen." That's rare. Evelyn didn't always know how to respond to that. But inside, she knew, this calm, steady way of being, was her beauty now. And it had nothing to do with how she looked in the mirror. Beauty in the details. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Grace stood in front of her hallway mirror, brushing through her silver blonde hair. She didn't dye it anymore. She didn't need to. The strands shimmered in the sunlight like soft threads of moonlight, framing her face in a way that felt honest. She never tried to look younger. That was never the point. But what she did do, every single day, was care. She moisturized, drank water, protected her skin from the sun. Not because she feared aging, but because she respected herself. That respect showed up in ways she hadn't even realized until people started pointing it out. At the hardware store last week, a woman about half her age tapped her on the shoulder and said, "I hope my skin looks like yours when I'm older. It's glowing." Grace had smiled, surprised. "Oh, thank you. That's sweet." It wasn't just her skin. People often complimented her posture too, the way she stood tall without trying to stand out. Years of yoga and refusing to let herself shrink into invisibility had paid off. Then there was her hair. She'd once worried about the grays, but now, people told her it was elegant. Regal, even. The silver added something bold. Distinct. She remembered once overhearing a young couple in a cafe whisper, "She's so graceful." At first, she thought they were talking about someone else. But when the girl turned and waved awkwardly at her, Grace realized they meant her. And maybe it wasn't just the features they were complimenting, it was what those features represented. A woman who valued herself, who carried her years with pride instead of shame. Beauty, she thought, was no longer about erasing time. It was about owning it. Grace and quiet confidence. Barbara wasn't flashy. Never had been. At 73, she wore soft earth tones, comfortable shoes, and kept her hair in a sleek low bun. Nothing about her screamed for attention, but somehow, she got it anyway. There was something magnetic about her presence. At the grocery store, people stepped aside without her asking. At restaurants, waitstaff treated her with unexpected reverence. Strangers smiled. Younger women leaned in to compliment the way she carried herself. It wasn't her appearance alone, it was her energy. That calm, centered confidence that comes only from a life fully lived. One afternoon, at her favorite coffee shop, a young woman asked if she could share the table. Barbara nodded. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," the girl said after a few minutes, "but you have this quiet strength. It's really beautiful." Barbara blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind." She'd never thought of herself as beautiful. Capable, yes. Smart, absolutely. But beautiful? Yet lately, people responded to her like they were seeing something she hadn't quite embraced herself. She'd started noticing too, how men of all ages seemed to respect her space but also sought her attention. How friends paused when she spoke, not out of politeness, but with genuine interest. Even her daughter had said the other day, "Mom, you make aging look empowering." The truth was, Barbara had long stopped caring about approval. That's what made her confidence so effortless. She didn't need anyone to validate her. She was her own validation. And it showed. The charisma of warmth. Diane never tried to be the center of attention. It just sort of happened. At 70, she had the soft, glowing presence of someone who'd spent a lifetime caring for others. A retired nurse, Diane had a face that made people feel safe, open, kind, and full of expression. Wherever she went, people gravitated toward her like moths to light. At the farmer's market, the barista always remembered her name. At her book club, conversation seemed to naturally circle back to her. Even complete strangers in checkout lines would strike up conversations with her as if they'd known her for years. It wasn't that Diane told riveting stories or had a commanding voice. Her secret was simpler: she made people feel seen. At a community luncheon one afternoon, a woman in her early 30s approached her. "You probably hear this all the time," she said with a bashful smile, "but you have the warmest energy. I feel calm just sitting near you." Diane chuckled. "You're sweet to say that. I think it's just from listening to a lot of people over the years." But it was more than that. Diane had what people often called charisma, though not the loud, dramatic kind. Hers was subtle, wrapped in compassion and authenticity. She was the kind of woman whose smile could light up a tired soul, who made space in a conversation for others to shine, who gave compliments that felt real and specific, not performative. People remembered her not for her outfits or her makeup, but for how they felt after talking to her: lighter, brighter, understood. Her beauty was in the way she saw people. And in return, they couldn't help but see the beauty in her. When people want to be around you. There was something about Carol that made people want to linger. She wasn't loud. She didn't command attention with dramatic entrances or booming laughter. Yet, somehow, wherever she went, people followed. At 68, Carol had learned the quiet power of being deeply present. When she spoke, she made people feel like they were the only ones in the room. She remembered names, followed up on small details, and laughed in a way that made others feel clever just for sharing a story. Her daughter-in-law once joked, "It's like you have gravity, Carol. Everyone just wants to orbit around you." At family gatherings, even the teens who usually buried their heads in their phones found themselves sitting near her, asking about her garden or what book she was reading. Her house was the kind where neighbors dropped by unannounced and always left feeling better than when they came in. Carol wasn't trying to be magnetic. She simply was. People invited her to events not because of obligation, but because they wanted her there. She brought a sense of ease with her, like the emotional equivalent of a cup of tea on a cold day. It wasn't about how she looked, though she had an elegant, timeless way about her. It was about how she made others feel welcomed, appreciated, safe. That kind of presence couldn't be faked. And it couldn't be taught in a magazine article about aging gracefully. It came from years of learning who she was and how to love people well. And that, more than anything, was what made her beautiful. The lasting beauty of self-acceptance. On her 75th birthday, Evelyn stood in front of the mirror, not to critique, but to appreciate. The lines around her eyes told stories of laughter and squinting into sunsets. The softness of her arms reminded her of the countless times they'd wrapped around grandchildren, carried groceries, and held hands in comfort. She didn't wish to be younger. She didn't long for her 20s. Those years had their time, but they weren't better, just different. In this season of her life, Evelyn felt something she never had before: peace. A wholeness that came from finally accepting herself, not just the good parts, but all the messy, beautiful, complicated pieces. And somehow, the world seemed to reflect that back to her. Strangers smiled at her. Younger women complimented her earrings or her laugh. Friends leaned in during conversations, often saying, "I love the way you put things." Even when she wasn't trying to make an impression, she left one. Because when a woman accepts herself fully, something extraordinary happens. The world can't help but admire her. It wasn't about hiding her age. It was about embracing it. Walking through life without apology. Letting her story show on her face and in her voice. And that confidence, that quiet strength, it didn't fade. It deepened. So if you've ever questioned your attractiveness, wondered if others still see your light, remember this. The most stunning thing about a woman is not her youth. It's the way she owns her space. It's the way she loves, listens, and lives without needing to prove anything to anyone. Like Evelyn. Like Carol, like all the women who've come into their own, your beauty only grows with time. The smile that changed the room. The room buzzed with energy, laughter bouncing off the walls, champagne glasses clinking, music humming low in the background. Elaine Morgan stood near the window, quietly watching her niece twirl across the floor with her new fiancé. At 64, Elaine was used to going unnoticed at events like this. She didn't mind. In fact, she preferred the soft edges of the evening, the quiet corners where she could observe, soak in, and smile. She wasn't dressed to stand out. A simple navy dress, a pearl necklace, and her silver-gray hair swept into a bun. But there was something about her. The way she smiled when someone caught her eye, genuinely, as if she had known them forever. The way her shoulders relaxed. The way she tilted her head slightly in conversation, it all came together like a soft light that filled the room. "Elaine," her sister called, waving her over to a group near the fireplace. Elaine walked over, calm and poised, her steps unhurried. As she entered the circle, people subtly shifted toward her. It wasn't dramatic. Just a natural reaction, as if everyone instinctively wanted to hear what she might say. "Hi, I'm Brian," said one of the guests, a friend of the groom. "You must be Caroline's aunt." Elaine offered her hand. "Elaine Morgan." "Yes, I am." "And you must be the one everyone's been talking about, the chef from Boston?" Brian laughed. "Guilty." "Wow, you're good." Elaine smiled again. This time with a soft spark in her eyes. Her presence didn't just make people feel welcome, it made them feel important. As the conversation unfolded, others joined in. Brian noticed how Elaine listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole face. Her eyes didn't drift. Her expressions were subtle but sincere. And when she laughed, it came from somewhere honest. Not loud. Not forced. Just warm. Across the room, a younger woman leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Who is that?" "The woman with the pearls. I think she's Caroline's aunt." "Isn't she beautiful?" The friend nodded. "She has that kind of glow. Like she's completely at ease with herself." Elaine never noticed the glances, the whispers, the admiration. She was too busy enjoying the moment, fully present, quietly powerful. That night, she didn't steal the spotlight. She became the light. And not with anything she wore or said, but simply with the way she carried herself. The power of listening. The next morning, Elaine found herself at her favorite little cafe on Maple Street, a cozy spot with worn leather chairs, mismatched mugs, and sunlight that spilled through the big front window like honey. She took her usual seat near the bookshelf, ordered her chai latte, and opened the novel tucked in her bag. It was her Saturday ritual, quiet, comforting, uninterrupted. Until someone spoke beside her. "Sorry, do you mind if I sit here?" asked a young woman, probably in her late 20s, balancing a laptop, headphones, and what looked like the weight of the world. Elaine smiled gently. "Of course. Please." The woman exhaled a soft, "Thank you," and dropped into the chair like she'd been running all week. A few minutes passed before she spoke again. "Do you ever feel like the more connected we are, the lonelier it gets?" Elaine looked up, surprised, but not uncomfortable. "I do," she said, after a pause. "But I've also learned that loneliness has less to do with being alone, and more to do with feeling unseen." The young woman blinked, caught off guard by how deeply that resonated. "I'm Ava. By the way." "Elaine." They talked. Well, Ava talked. Elaine listened. Not with polite nods or distracted smiles, but with presence. She leaned in just enough, eyes warm and steady. Her brow furrowing in quiet empathy when Ava mentioned how hard the last year had been, her breakup, losing her job, feeling like no one really heard her anymore. Elaine didn't interrupt. Didn't try to fix. She just listened. And when she finally did speak, her words were few, but meaningful. "I don't think you're lost," she said. "I think you're just in between. That place where things fall apart so better things can find you." Ava's eyes welled up. Do you talk to people like this all the time?" she asked, half laughing, brushing away a tear. Elaine chuckled softly. "Only when I'm lucky enough to be invited in." By the time Ava left the cafe, she was smiling, and not the fake kind. She turned back at the door and looked at Elaine, who had returned to her book, calm as ever. In that brief conversation, Elaine had given Ava something rare, the feeling of being truly seen, heard, valued. And Ava would remember that forever. More than skin deep. Later that evening, Elaine walked through the quiet park near her apartment, her scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, hands tucked into her coat pockets. The air was crisp. And the trees swayed gently above her, their bare branches drawing soft silhouettes against the darkening sky. As she walked, her thoughts drifted, not to anything dramatic, just moments. Moments from years gone by. Conversations. Glances. That strange way people would sometimes seem more comfortable around her than they were with each other. She remembered her neighbor's teenage daughter, who would always come to her porch just to talk, even though she barely spoke to anyone else. Or the young man at the library who'd once told her, "You make the quiet feel less lonely." At the time, she didn't think much of it. She had never been one to chase compliments or seek attention. But now, with time and stillness, she was starting to understand. It was never about looking younger. Never about wearing more makeup or dressing like someone else. It was about the way she made people feel. Elaine paused at the park bench she loved, the one by the fountain. She sat down, letting the weight of the day fall off her shoulders. She thought about her reflection, how the lines around her eyes deepened when she smiled, how her silver hair caught the light in the morning. These things didn't bother her anymore. In fact, she found them beautiful in their own way. Proof of a life well lived, of stories told and untold. She recalled something her late husband once said. "You have this way of walking into a room and making it feel safer. Like people can finally exhale." Elaine had brushed it off back then. But now, she let it in. People weren't drawn to her because of her face. They were drawn to her energy. Her calm. Her quiet strength. The kind of beauty that can't be put on with a brush or covered with a filter. The kind that only deepens with time. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze kiss her cheeks. More than ever, she knew, her beauty wasn't fading. It was unfolding. The glances she didn't notice. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Judith Reynolds realized something strange was happening. She stood in the aisle of her favorite bookstore, holding a hardcover biography and pretending to read the back. In truth, she was distracted, trying to figure out if the man near the end cap had just looked at her again. He had. And it wasn't the first time that week someone had done that. Judith was 68, a retired lawyer with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She'd spent decades commanding courtrooms, writing closing arguments, and keeping her emotions tightly tucked behind a crisp blazer. But retirement had softened her. Not in strength, she still carried herself with purpose, but in warmth. What surprised her most, though, was the attention. Not catcalls or flattery, thank God those days were gone, but something different. Something quieter. Last week at the grocery store, a man had held the door a moment longer than necessary, smiling just a beat too long. At a restaurant, the server had leaned in closer, clearly more engaged with her than anyone else at the table. Even younger women had started complimenting her, on her scarf, her perfume, her posture. At first, Judith brushed it off. Coincidence. Politeness. Flukes. But after the third stranger in a week smiled at her as if they were meeting a woman from a storybook, she began to wonder if something else was going on. She called Elaine. "You ever notice people looking at you?" Judith asked over the phone that evening, wine glass in hand. "Like really looking?" Elaine laughed. "You mean noticing you?" "Yeah. That. All the time," Elaine said, with that calm tone Judith always envied. "They're not looking at your age, Judith. They're responding to your presence." Judith was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, half joking, "So, what, am I finally glowing or something?" Elaine's voice softened. "You've always been glowing. You're just starting to believe it." That night, Judith stood in front of her mirror longer than usual. She studied the lines near her eyes, the way her jaw had softened, the gray streaks running through her thick chestnut hair. She didn't look like her 30-year-old self. But there was something in her gaze that hadn't been there back then. Something grounded. Still. Radiant in its own way. Maybe people weren't just being nice. Maybe they were seeing her now, really seeing her. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to see it too. The glances she didn't notice. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Judith Reynolds realized something strange was happening. She stood in the aisle of her favorite bookstore, holding a hardcover biography and pretending to read the back. In truth, she was distracted, trying to figure out if the man near the end cap had just looked at her again. He had. And it wasn't the first time that week someone had done that. Judith was 68, a retired lawyer with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. She'd spent decades commanding courtrooms, writing closing arguments, and keeping her emotions tightly tucked behind a crisp blazer. But retirement had softened her. Not in strength, she still carried herself with purpose, but in warmth. What surprised her most, though, was the attention. Not catcalls or flattery, thank God those days were gone, but something different. Something quieter. Last week at the grocery store, a man had held the door a moment longer than necessary, smiling just a beat too long. At a restaurant, the server had leaned in closer, clearly more engaged with her than anyone else at the table. Even younger women had started complimenting her, on her scarf, her perfume, her posture. At first, Judith brushed it off. Coincidence. Politeness. Flukes. But after the third stranger in a week smiled at her as if they were meeting a woman from a storybook, she began to wonder if something else was going on. She called Elaine. "You ever notice people looking at you?" Judith asked over the phone that evening, wine glass in hand. "Like really looking?" Elaine laughed. "You mean noticing you?" "Yeah. That. All the time, Elaine said, with that calm tone Judith always envied. They're not looking at your age, Judith. They're responding to your presence. Judith was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, half joking, so, what, am I finally glowing or something? Elaine's voice softened. You've always been glowing. You're just starting to believe it. That night, Judith stood in front of her mirror longer than usual. She studied the lines near her eyes, the way her jaw had softened, the gray streaks running through her thick chestnut hair. She didn't look like her 30-year-old self. But there was something in her gaze that hadn't been there back then. Something grounded. Still. Radiant in its own way. Maybe people weren't just being nice. Maybe they were seeing her now, really seeing her. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to see it too. Eyes that speak without words. Claire Monroe had always been told she had expressive eyes. She used to laugh it off, saying things like, they probably just mean I can't hide what I'm feeling. But deep down, she knew there was something in her gaze that reached people before her words ever did. It wasn't about the color, though her stormy gray eyes were striking, or about makeup, which she barely wore. It was the way her eyes listened, the way they softened when someone opened up, the way they lit up when she was amused. Or widened just slightly when something caught her by surprise. Her eyes were honest. And that honesty drew people in. One evening, Claire was at a local art gallery for a charity event. The room was full of polished conversations and clinking glasses, people discussing brushstrokes and lighting as if they were reviewing financial reports. Claire stood quietly in front of a painting of a single bird in flight, its wings spread wide over a field of golden wheat. Something about it moved her. It reminded her of her childhood summers in Kansas. The freedom. The warmth. The silence that felt like home. She didn't say a word. A man beside her glanced over and asked, "You see something in it, don't you?" Claire turned her head, and her eyes met his. And for a second, he forgot the question. "It's just, the way you look at it," he stammered. "Like you're seeing something I missed." Claire smiled softly, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Maybe it's not about seeing more. Maybe it's just about seeing deeper. That one moment led to a real conversation. The kind where two people forget the rest of the room exists. By the end of the night, the man, whose name was Ethan, told her he hadn't had a conversation that meaningful in years. It wasn't what she said that moved him. It was how she made him feel while she said it. Claire never realized how magnetic she was in those moments. How her gaze gave people permission to be honest, to be vulnerable, to feel safe. She didn't try to impress anyone. She didn't need to. Her eyes did the speaking. Her presence did the rest. And in a world of loud voices and louder egos, that quiet, authentic connection? It was unforgettable. The second glance. It happened again. Savannah Blake was walking through the atrium of the downtown museum when she caught it out of the corner of her eye, a man, mid-conversation. Pausing just long enough to glance at her as she passed by. He wasn't obvious. Just one of those quick looks, like a flicker of curiosity. But it wasn't fleeting. He looked once. Then looked again. And it wasn't the first time. In the past few months, Savannah had started noticing it more, second glances. Not ogling, not gawking. Just a quiet kind of attention that lingered a moment too long to be accidental. At first, she wasn't sure what to make of it. She was 63. A retired music teacher. She still loved red lipstick, jazz records, and the feel of linen blouses in the summer. But she had never thought of herself as the kind of woman who turned heads. That was someone else, someone younger, someone louder. But here she was, in a season of life where many women felt invisible, and somehow, she was being seen more than ever. She'd notice it in the elevator at her condo building, in the cafe near the library, in the way strangers seemed to smile at her without any particular reason. One afternoon, her niece, a college student named Marissa, said something that stuck. "You know, Aunt Savannah, you walk like someone who already knows how the story ends. Like nothing can shake you." Savannah laughed. "That's because I've lived through the messy middle already." But it made her think. Maybe the reason people looked at her wasn't about youth or looks at all. Maybe it was about the way she moved. The way she owned space without apology. The way she wore confidence like silk, soft but undeniable. There was something powerful about being a woman who no longer chased validation. Who didn't shrink or strive or ask for permission. She wasn't trying to be noticed. But people noticed anyway. The second glances weren't about vanity. They were about presence. Savannah kept walking through the museum, pausing in front of a sculpture bathed in sunlight. She tilted her head, smiled to herself, and stood still for a moment, letting the warmth settle over her like a soft memory. Behind her, someone else paused too. Another second glance. Another quiet reminder. She was far from invisible. A beauty that evolves. The sun filtered in through the tall windows of the Community Arts Center where Elaine Carter taught watercolor painting on Wednesday afternoons. Her class was full of people at different stages of life, some retired, some rediscovering themselves after raising families, some simply looking for a creative escape. Elaine, now 66, was the kind of woman who looked more radiant in person than in any photo. Not because of makeup or filters, she barely wore either, but because she glowed from somewhere deeper. Her students loved her. Not just for her talent, but for her warmth. The way she remembered their names, the softness in her voice, the way she noticed the effort even in the messiest brushstrokes. One afternoon, during a break, a new student, a woman in her early 40s, approached Elaine with a quiet question. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "How do you stay so graceful? So beautiful, really. I don't mean just how you look. I mean how you are." Elaine smiled, humbled. She looked down at her paint-stained hands, then back at the woman. "I stopped chasing perfection," she said. "Somewhere in my 50s, I realized beauty isn't about keeping up. It's about letting go." The woman tilted her head, intrigued. Elaine continued. "Letting go of needing to be the smartest in the room. Letting go of fixing things for everyone. Letting go of that little voice that always said, 'You're not enough yet.'" She paused, then added. "That's when everything changed. My energy, my posture, the way people responded to me. It wasn't about looking young. It was about feeling whole." Elaine had come to understand something deeply true, that real beauty wasn't static. It evolved. It got deeper with age. Richer. More layered. And far more magnetic. The compliments she received these days weren't about appearances. They were about how she made people feel. The barista at the cafe remembered her drink not just because she was a regular, but because she listened when he talked about music school. Neighbors lingered longer when they ran into her because conversations with Elaine felt like home. Even strangers seemed to soften when they spoke to her. She didn't need to be the loudest voice or the sharpest dresser. She was simply herself. Authentic. Present. Beautiful, in a way that could only come from years of living fully and loving deeply. As class resumed, Elaine returned to her easel, her brush dancing across the paper. A student whispered to another, "There's just something about her, isn't there?" And the answer was simple. Yes. There was. Elaine was proof that aging wasn't about fading, it was about arriving.